Included with an interesting text-to-world connection. It makes you pay more attention to how you treat children who have siblings, what you say, how you act around them. We should try not to make comparisons between them and to prevent such feelings of inferiority. After these 2 days on her coursework, she returned to the Bible and articles about current religious controversies when choosing texts that she wanted to write about. On the 5th day, she wrote about her reading of James chapter 1 and drew an interesting connection to some text about the Cinderella myth she had been reading in her composition class. She says, the whole faithfully preserving trials so in the end you will be rewarded thing is actually like the Cinderella story in a way, she wrote. On the 6th day, she wrote about her reading of Romans, 1 John, James, Isaiah, and Philippians. On the next day, she chose to write about, the text she chose to write about came from the popular press. But again, she chose to focus on something that, as she says, raised an itch. That was her phrase about her faith. She reported on her reading of an article called Evolution, We Can't Sit Idly By, in a magazine called Sky and Telescope, which I was not familiar with. She described the article's main point as follows. Things are only going to get worse in our school systems if religious beliefs about scientific facts are not taught as part of science in our classrooms. Angela argued against this view, taking the position that each side of the coin should get equal consideration and concluding that the author, quote, has not sincerely dealt with religious possibilities. But rather than simply adhering to the conservative line in the creationism versus evolution debate, Angela revealed that she was not only willing to admit another view, but tries regularly to do so. When I read things like this, she writes, I tend automatically to come up with ideas that support what I've been brought up to believe, but I try to keep an open mind without a biased opinion. Angela's last journal entry provided a fascinating summation of her commentary on reading texts that lead to theological questioning. She read an article entitled The Bible is Still Number One in a magazine called A Matter of Fact. She encapsulated the main point of this article. Prophecy and scientific foreknowledge are repeated in the Bible, giving evidence of the credibility as the Word of God. She drew a powerful connection between this text and herself. She said, if I could go into apologetics for a career, the article would definitely relate to my future job. Tacitly conceding that she probably won't have that option as a career, she added, regardless, it's good to have a rational foundation in what you're trying to put your trust in. She saw possible connections between this text and others she might read for courses on personal interest. The more I read about this, she writes, the more I have to implement other texts into my thinking. It helps me to have a well-rounded approach so that I can look at things more objectively. So now here's a student that I think if you had her in class, you'd probably say, you know, she's not a very good student. She doesn't raise questions in class. She doesn't raise her hand. But notice that she did have this active reading life that we were able to tap into. We actually have, in this larger piece, we have two other case studies. One is about a woman named Pauline Rosario, who was very interested in Latin American issues, having come, she was second generation Colombian, and so read extensively about issues of Latin American politics. And finally, a young man named Corey Essene, who was reading in French, not because he wanted to do anything with that for his career. He was taking a French course, but he had been on a backpacking trip through France early in the year, had made a friend, and they decided that they were going to correspond in French along the way. So there were interesting motivations for reading and writing that really had nothing to do with his courses, which he largely blew off. Now, while neither of us had Angela or Pauline or Corey, the other two in class, when we read their profiles, we tended to think that we might like to have these students in class. Here were three students, all engaged readers, all capable to some degree of connecting their reading to their own growing sense of the world about them. We venture that many instructors would find these students, Angela and Corey and Pauline, to represent the kind of students they normally encounter in courses. Not very interested in the assigned readings, not eager to participate in discussion, not inclined to read more deeply than the assignment requires. The kinds of students who inspire that water cooler conversation. So what did we learn about the students from reading their journals? What kind of students are these typical college students? Let's unpack these questions before turning to a thorny issue of how both high school and college faculty members might think differently about reading in their courses. First of all, our students were reading, but they weren't reading studiously, either in the terms of the text they were engaging with or in the manner in which they read them. Like the high school boys whose literate practices Michael Smith and Jeffrey Wilhelm described in a wonderful book called Reading Don't Fix No Chevys. If you don't know that book, read it. It's a great book. The U of A students often evinced a passion for reading that was not connected to their courses. But instead, they saw the courses, the reading they had to do for school as uninspiring, dull, and painfully required. Remember Angela's response to her sociology text. I completely agree with it, and it raises no questions. Corey, in his case study, assesses his fundamental communication reading as being self-evident, and he talks about his rapid perusal of an essay called The Genocidal Killer in the Mirror. He says, I'll read this only because I have to generate a thesis about it. So his reading for a composition course wasn't really reading for reading. It was reading just in order to generate a thesis. While Angela's and Corey's responses to school-based reading, typical in many of our participants, are rather neutrally dismissive, other students were more adamantly critical. One student, Jennifer Respighi, described how she took only 5 minutes to read a sample biology lab report because, quote, it was so boring. Another student, Catherine Quick, described her psychology textbook as, quote, a brutally boring overwad, end quote, and she skipped sections because there's no reason to read a bunch of BS.